Hello. I think you can hear me now. Hopefully. Hopefully you can hear me now. The little bar is going, so I'm gonna say that it's a yes. So I will work on sending out copies of that link. So it will alert you guys. Cool. So hello and welcome. I'm just gonna finish off my cranberry juice there. Move this far out. Hi. Okay. So hello and welcome to the film strip. Hooray, we have sound. Great achievement, great personal achievements. And today we're talking about Can't Buy Me Love, which is a pretty good movie from 1997. I definitely enjoy it. There are a lot of things about the movie that maybe don't stand up as well with the test of time, but the closer that we get to the 90s and the closer that we get to what we consider teen comedies, I really think that this is sort of a breath of fresh air in how it's a little bit understated. It does play on a lot of familiar beats, but it does it in a sort of fun way that I think sort of respects the characters in a way that other teen movies would not. So I'm excited. If you guys have any first impressions or comments or questions, we can. I'm definitely open to hearing those. I like responding to the chat. I don't know how awkward that is for you guys to like watch me reading it, but I really like having the back and forth. So it's cliched in the way that you know that I'm going to turn this off. So if I get texts, I'm not going to make a sound. So it's cliched in the way that you know the way that the story is going to go, but I don't think it's cliched in the way that it treats its characters. So there are moments that seem very genuine and sort of heartfelt that I think you don't really get in a lot of other movies that are also going by the numbers, but those sort of feel like, yeah, exactly. It was one of the first movies to do that sort of storyline. So now it feels cliched, but they were actually you can kind of tell that at the time they weren't as used to those kinds of stories. So they were telling it with all sort of emotion and earnestness that kind of disappeared from later versions of that story, because you can definitely watch other movies that have the same plot and it's just sort of like, oh, this plot is popular, so let's just go through the beats. And this one was actually kind of trying to tell a story, and like, even if you don't necessarily agree with the kind of with the way that the story was told, or you think that it's a little bit over the top or cheesy, I can definitely understand like the big speech at the end sort of not being the most comfortable for some people, because it's a little on the nose. It's very on the nose. But they were trying to make a point with the story. And I feel like a lot of people who copied this movie were just doing it as a cash in. And I think this movie actually genuinely meant the story that they were telling, which I think makes a big difference in the way that they respect the characters, in the way that they sort of develop the relationship. I think the relationship between the two main characters and like the way that they negotiate and the way that they talk to each other is really interesting and unique. So to me, it's a breath of fresh air because I'm used to the stories. I'm used to the movies telling these stories, not really caring all that much. And I feel like this movie actually does care. So that's what I mean by breath of fresh air. Not necessarily that you can't see what the end is coming, but the experience of the movie feels more fresh than watching a different one. I think we kind of get caught up in like if you know how a story is going to go, then the story is no longer useful to you. And people want to be constantly surprised, and I'm definitely more interested in the experience of the movie and the way that like the story is being told, and if that's if there are degrees by which you can understand the story or connect with it in different interesting ways. So I'm happy to watch I'm shutting viewers. So I'm happy to watch a movie. I'm happy to watch a movie, 10 movies with the same plot, told the same way, and like know what the ending is, as long as each movie sort of means what they're saying or does something different with it or presents something new. And I think this movie at the time definitely presented something new, even though it seems very cliched now. And I think that the way that they did it was also very unique for the time. Not many other movies have such a sense of place that this movie does. They actually filmed on location in Tucson, and like they used real locations in Tucson, and that feels very like grounded and real, in a way that I feel like a lot of 80s and 90s movies do not have that like sense of I don't know, Western influence type place. So that was my take on the whole cliche. I know that a lot of people feel that way. But yeah, I mean, it's a little ridiculous, I guess. I don't know Tucson. I don't know from Tucson, so maybe it's a little ridiculous that people have lawns there, which Mallory pointed out. But I'm sure someone does. I'm sure some suburban knight does have a lawn in Tucson. And Cindy is supposed to sort of be rich anyway, so it makes sense that she has a lawn. So I guess Ronnie is mowing all the lawns of the more popular, well-endowed people. So I guess the other things that I wanted to talk about, we can definitely talk a little bit more about clichéness or first impressions if you're interested in that. So I think it depends on what we necessarily. So Mallory asked, do I think some element of cliché is necessary to romantic comedies, or like to their success? And I think it depends on what we mean by cliche. I think there is a subset of people who watch romantic comedies for the cliche. And if it doesn't really adhere to that cliche, they're not getting what they want out of the film. I would say that, you know, there are movies that people might say that they're cliche. Like, I think creativity isn't necessarily opposed to cliche. So I wouldn't say that the Philadelphia story is cliche. I don't know that elements of that story feel cliche to me, but I'm sure, but like it is a love triangle movie, and a lot of movies are about love triangles, so it's a cliche in that way. But the way that they approach it, so it's whether like the elements, it's whether the elements or the story beats are cliche, I guess. I do think the success of some movies, some romantic comedies, I think we've come to expect romantic comedies be cliche, or it's a trope to say that romantic comedies are cliche. Like people expect it. That's how people sort of write romantic comedies off. And I think that's not necessarily fair. I don't think romantic comedies are as cliche as people say they are. I think some popular ones definitely were. I think sometimes the things that rise in popularity are occasionally cliche, and it's all a matter of like how good the actors are, and like how well it's executed. But I don't think that it's inherent to romantic comedies, because I think superhero movies can be cliche. I think comedies can be cliche. I think dramas can be incredibly cliche sometimes. So I don't necessarily think that. I think it's not very. I know that it's like a commonly held belief that romantic comedies are somewhat cliche, and therefore they're not artistic and they don't have any merit. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think all movies have some amount of cliche in them, and I think romantic comedies aren't exactly exempt from that. I think there are some funs that there is some fun you can have with romantic comedy cliches, and you can have that fun with a lot of other genres as well. But the people tying romantic comedies to cliches is sort of is a bit of I don't know, pet peeve of mine, I guess. I don't think that they're necessary to success. And I think we've seen a lot of movies that aren't cliche, that are successful romantic comedies. This is definitely a genre that enjoys playing with the tropes of what was cliche and what isn't. Because as we saw with Down with Love, it was very much playing on these preconceived notions of what romantic comedies are, and what the tropes of the movies are. And it definitely goes back and forth on how on audience expectation of like, oh, this is convoluted, oh, this is cliche, oh, like this, like, oh, I knew that you knew this, because that's sort of a running joke in romantic comedies, I guess. Just like knowing what the other person is up to, and how that other person is like playing the game. Excuse me. So I think it is, but not more than any other genre relies on cliches. I don't know if that answers your question or not. It's an interesting question, because I think the answer is yes, but the answer is also at the same time very much no. So welcome to academia, I guess. A non-answer answer is our specialty. So yeah, I guess it definitely for teen movies. Would you call this less of a romantic comedy, more of a coming of age story? It seems like a major theme of the movie is the importance of staying true to yourself, which I definitely agree with. I think a lot of teen movies at the time were coming of age stories. I think because teen movies became so popular, they were kind of the superhero genre of the time. And so the way that superhero genres are, the way that the superhero genre works now is that you take the genres that already and this happens all the time, it's not just superheroes, but you take the genre that already existed and then you apply it with the superhero format. So you have superhero political intrigue, and you have a superhero noir, and you have a superhero, kids movie, and that helps, that makes it so the genres are palatable, that the movies are palatable and distinguishable from each other. Guardians of the Galaxy has a very, very different flavor than Captain America, even though they're both Marvel. They each kind of take on their own genre and their own spin on the genre. And I feel like the same thing sort of happened with teen movies in the 80s and 90s, in that they took on all these other genres like dramas, coming of age stories, romantic comedies, supernatural movies like Teen Wolf. And it became a sort of, they all sort of had these hallmarks of teen movies, but I would say that this movie, as opposed to like The Breakfast Club or 16 Candles, is more of a romantic comedy because it has more of those beats that we're familiar with. It's the central premise of the movie is about the relationship between these two characters. It's a coming of age story in that the characters learn personal things about themselves. It has a message that is trying to appeal to teenagers, but it does that at the same time that it is sort of moving towards if there's a question of like whether this is a comedy, but I actually think that a lot of the comedy in this movie, when it's not fart jokes, is sort of understated. So there are moments that are sort of observational character humor. That's very different than sort of the witty it does have witty back and forth, but it's sort of different than the sort of vaudeville style of humor of like the earlier movies that we watched. But I do think it does count as a comedy and it counts as a romance. And I think because the central theme of the movie is a romantic comedy, then it does that's why I included it. I thought it was more of a romantic comedy than, Ferris Bueller, even though Ferris has a girlfriend. And that is one of the themes of the movie. The main plot of the movie does not revolve around him getting together with his girlfriend. So if you think about it in also a broader sense, if we want to go back to The Awful Truth, this movie sort of has a plot of remarriage in which the characters are sort of together, and we got to see them together, and then they have this fight and they break up, and so the end of the movie is their remarriage, and it follows that very standard 1930s screwball comedy of remarriage plot. So I think while it does have other themes in the movie, most good movies have more than one theme. I do think that it does count as a romantic comedy. It's a coming of age romantic comedy, maybe, because that's definitely present. But there's no Asta, which is unfortunate. I think the other thing that I definitely wanted to talk about the character of Cindy, because rewatching this movie, I was very surprised with how much I liked her, and with how much she doesn't necessarily have, I mean, she does have agency, but that's not really the surprise. The surprise is sort of how much she sticks up for herself, I guess. I will get to the question about comedic highlights after this little rant. But she really sort of knows herself and like has a presence and like isn't afraid to tell someone to go sit in the asshole section, which I thought was a comedic comment. I thought that the movie never really punishes her in any way. So she goes through hard times, but the movie, yeah. So the movie doesn't really punish her. The surprise is that she's not a terrible person. She really knows herself and like knows what she wants and like isn't it like. She admits that she's trying to impress other people, that popularity is sort of like a job. She's very honest, and that she's not a terrible person, and she's able to change her mind, and she has these priorities that are important to her, but she's also she can also be like very vulnerable and open, and she sort of has an inner life, and the movie goes out of its way to show that. And I think that was really important. And I think that focus on the female character might be some of the reason why people started thinking that like women would prefer romantic comedies, because women are generally so much better represented in romantic comedies than they are in other movies. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes the writers don't think about women as people, and that's very obvious when you watch romantic comedies. But in good romantic comedies, and generally there are more women writing romantic comedies than men, you will see like percentage-wise, you're more likely to see a woman writer or a woman director for romantic comedies, even though there like aren't that many in general. So I think that's why it's considered like a woman's movie, or like why they're considered chick flicks is because they appeal to women, which I think is so insane, because women are people and they deserve to be people across the board. For the comedic highlights, there was this one moment where they're at the New Year's party, and like the senior is like hitting on a freshman or something, and he's just like, I always bring my own wine, and she tries it and it's definitely trash, and he's just like, oh, I'm all about class, and that's really just like an aside, but I thought it was like really funny. There are moments there are sort of like some of the exchanges between Ronnie and Cindy I thought were kind of funny, just like kind of sweet, but also like just like I don't know. There's a lot of the things that the side characters said, like the way that they snipe at each other. It was more, I don't know if that's making a sound. I think it's more a bit Jane Austen, like social comedy more than like comedy, or not comedy, but more than like slapstick or like really over the top jokes or like blatant jokes, but I do think that there is social comedy in the movie, which makes it a romantic comedy. And just little character notes, like I didn't personally think Seth Green's character. So there are points where I thought Seth Green's character was funny. I agree that I was not a huge fan of the fart jokes, but there are other parts where he was sort of interesting. I thought the line, "Here's a theory of relativity for you. If you don't change the channel, I'll have one less relative." I thought that was a pretty good line. So there are like certain lines and certain interactions that I thought count as comedy, or were the comedic highlights for me. What's somewhat interesting to me is that most of the students fit into very defined stereotypes. And Ronald starts to fall into the stereotype and is ostracized. Yeah, I mean, I think Ronald definitely goes overboard with popularity and stands out from like the popular kids because he's trying so hard. But I did actually think that his friend Kenneth was interesting, or like the way that the nerds were portrayed as weak nerds. The movie did really emphasize, cheerleaders and jocks and nerds, which was a little over the top, although that might have been what high school was like. I don't know. I wasn't born, but like I was like too young for that era. But I think that like having cards night, I haven't seen nerds really. I've never seen like nerds having cards night as like a nerdy thing. Usually nerds are always, D&D and like can't talk to people and like are just like so out there and weird. And these nerds were a bit more humanized, I think, and a bit closer to like the nerds that I know. I think Kenneth is also definitely interesting because he's just kind of a good guy and he's kind of shown to be a good guy. And like it's just the movie doesn't make fun of him for being a nerd, and he enjoys being a nerd, and he says out loud, like, yeah, I'm a nerd and I don't want to be popular. That's not who I am and that's not who I want to be. And I enjoy our weekly cards night and that's good for me. And it's a nice contrast to Ronald, who is like so desperate for popularity because he's bought into this idea that like popularity is power and popularity is everything. And he's just like wrong about that. So I also thought that Kenneth wasn't interesting, and he just like gets so screwed over in this movie, but eventually gets vindicated, I guess. But yeah, Ronnie definitely starts not over identifying, that's the wrong word, but he starts, the first time I saw it, because I've seen it twice this week, the first time I saw it, I didn't quite understand necessarily why he was making the decisions he did, because it seemed really foreign and dumb to me, to just like completely ignore this beautiful girl who's clearly in love with you in favor of, I don't know, high-fiving a jock who wasn't that nice to you anyway. But I think he really gets caught up in this idea that popularity is going to be good for him and that this is fun, and he starts convincing himself that this is fun even if it's not. And that's definitely a sort of train of thought that can get people. So once he sort of gets on this train and he like commits to like being the most popular and like needing to be the most popular, he gets to a point that it's sort of over the top, and even though people are kind of still supporting him, it's really easy to pull the rug out from under him because it's all in one place, which is why he has such a collapse at the end of the movie. Deservedly so, but yeah. And he kind of thinks that it's gonna I don't know what he thought was gonna happen, but he definitely, I was under the impression that he thought it would just like keep perpetuating itself, even though it was unsustainable. So it's an interesting look, I guess, at that idea of success and what it means to like have success. And who's defining it and who gets to say what it is. And I'm not sure that he didn't like feel ostracized while he was popular anyway. It was just the feeling of not being ostracized was like so nice to him. I guess I didn't relate as much. I relate more to Kenneth than I do to Ronald. But yeah. And his family is kind of just like a non-entity. His family doesn't really like. He has a mom and a dad and a brother, and they don't really like care what's going on with him. And he he kind of like, it's like the brother is kind of like trying to explain to his parents that like that his sibling is having basically a breakdown, like having a complete like snap, like break from reality, and they're just standing there trimming the hedges. So I guess they're just letting Ronald do what he does because they like trust him to be smart or be responsible or whatever. But they don't really intervene at any point. That's kind of what I meant by a lot of these movies show parents in less than in less. So a lot of these movies don't have parents in supportive roles, which was kind of new for the time to like sort of acknowledge that like families can be broken in some way, or like you might not be getting the attention that you need at home, and how isolating that might be. There's definitely Rebel Without a Cause, which is all about like the inter-family drama of like the son not being able to communicate with his parents and how isolating that is. But you start getting in the 80s sort of parents who maybe don't have the best interests of their kids at heart. And that was sort of new for the time. So like having parents who are like disinterested in their kid to that extent is, I think, one of the John Hughes effects that I was talking about, like introducing these ideas of adult themes or circumstances into the world of teenagers. I don't know that that's necessarily, I don't know that necessarily accounts for his shallowness. I feel like he's shallow because he's a 16-year-old guy or 18-year-old guy, or maybe that's me writing guys off. But yes, Dad, thank you. I think that I don't know that that necessarily accounts for his jerk behavior. Because his parents weren't around, but it might have something to do with it. So I guess, so if there are other things, we talked about the comedy, we can definitely talk about modernity, because there's a lot, like the movie is very like modern, especially in its soundtrack. We kind of get the first movie that like depends on its soundtrack for the mood, or like modern days. One of the things that struck me as funny is that Ronnie goes to American Bandstand for the latest dance moves instead of MTV, which is just like insane to me, because MTV was like the biggest thing, and that's also one of the reasons why there's like so much music in the movie, like to appeal to teenagers. That's really the time that music started being integrated into films in that way. We can kind of talk about the negotiation between Ronnie and Cindy, the way that they negotiate their relationship. I think that they're really frank with each other. I think it's kind of cute the way that they like talk about the way that their relationship is going to go, and they both have to agree on it beforehand. It's an interesting interesting version of consent. It's not necessarily what was I going to say? The most standard, but it is consent. It doesn't have to be standard. So the soundtrack of American Graffiti 15 years earlier definitely counts. That is sort of like the soundtrack of the time. That is more of a nostalgic soundtrack, I think, because you're looking back at, I think, because American Graffiti is set in the 50s, right? So you're sort of looking back at the great hits of that time, and this movie is definitely about the present and now. But I did mention how American Graffiti is sort of one of the blueprints for teen movies of this time. Just looking at the social landscape and like the social dynamics of high school and like how people interact with each other. So it definitely influenced this movie, and having a soundtrack in the 60s. definitely having the appropriate soundtrack for that time helps lend like authenticity to the setting, because like you're hearing what's on the radio. And yeah, I think if we want to talk about high school as like a microcosm of society, I think we can definitely talk about. It's interesting because rom-coms are so obsessed with society in a way, even though it's about the romantic negotiation between two genders, because gendered conceits are so societal. It ends up being a commentary on society, regardless of like it's political whether it wants to be or not, I guess, because the negotiation or battle between the sexes is a societal battle, or is perceived to be. So it's always a comment on society. So it always sort of radiates out in other ways. So if you want to look at high school as a microcosm of society, this movie definitely has some things to say about popularity, or the ways that we, I don't know, the ways that we're sort of, a lot of people are, what's it called? Self-contradicting. Not oxymoron. What's the word for like when you say one thing and do another? But they're fickle. And I think most of the people in this movie are pretty fickle. And it sort of comes off as, so like Cindy is like still friends with her friends at the end of the movie. And then all of a sudden they support her going off with Ronnie, I guess. It sort of seems like things are going back the way they were, and then it changes. So it's this interesting sort of view of, I guess, incremental change, you could say, because he does seem to like make something of an impact. Hypocritical, that's the word. Thank you. A lot of people seem to be a bit hypocritical in this movie. But he does seem to sort of make some sort of change. And I think this movie, I think the reason I chose this movie is because it's a bit more understated than a lot of the other teen drama romances. The other one I considered was maybe Pretty in Pink, but I also feel like a lot of people have maybe seen that. And I also feel like Pretty in Pink doesn't have as much comedy in it as this movie does. And I think 16 Candles isn't a romantic comedy. It's more like a drama, and like she has a crush on Jake. And also I just don't like 16 Candles. Even though next week we're kind of watching another movie that I'm not a huge fan of, apparently. We're still going to watch it. But I just, there are so many elements of 16 Candles that I can't really stomach. So we're just not going to pay attention to it. Every guy in this movie seems to treat Cindy like trash, which is absolutely true. She, like, I think it does actually make a point of like how women are treated and like viewed, and like it's weird because this movie sometimes sort of makes an attempt at showing how like weirdly and disgustingly sexualized women are, and then it'll go ahead and like do the same thing. Yeah, it's the reason why I think the relationship stands out as opposed to like a lot of the other relationships in the movie is that Ronald treats her like a person, like Mallory said. So I think that's one of the main draws of the movie is like watching, like clearly the reason like Cindy likes Ronald is that like he treats her as an equal and as a person, and like cares about what she has to say, and like is supportive of her poetry, and like even though he uses it later because he was being shallow. And I think that this theme of treating women as people pops up a lot in romantic comedies, because a lot of romantic comedies are sort of social fantasies, specifically for women, because so I think that's why a lot of these cliches tend to happen, is because it's this idea of getting what you like, having a support system. Like, wouldn't it be nice if my boyfriend treated me like a person and cared about what I had to say and like listened to my advice, or like, yeah, it's just like had conversations with me. And I think that's another reason why we sometimes maybe fall into the same tropes sometimes, because a lot of people want similar things. And I think that's one of the ways that I can tell a good comedy from a bad, or a good rom-com from a bad rom-com, or in my personal opinion, is if the main character is like treated like a person first, and not a woman or an object of desire. That's a really important one. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I like this movie so much. And I think that's one of the things that surprised her, because that surprised her with the situation, because you can kind of see over that month, she sort of likes him more and more. And I think it's because she was expecting him to like be gross because he's paying her to go out with him. And that's not a really cool thing to do. But he was actually like, was genuine in his desperation, and wanting to be popular. And like, he was very respectful of her, I guess. So yeah, that was Can't Buy Me Love. If you didn't enjoy it, I hope you at least got something out of it. I definitely enjoyed it. And it's good to keep in mind that, like, even if the movie isn't a movie that you like or enjoy, that there are still things in it that's worth watching. Like, if you're interested in film studies, it's important to watch the good with the bad. And it's about film as a whole. And I do think Can't Buy Me Love is pretty good representation of 80s rom-com. I wouldn't want to say anything, because that's definitely a drama. A lot of romance in the 80s and a lot of teen movies in the 80s came with a really heavy dose of drama. And this one doesn't. It's more of a stereotypical, like, straight up comedy, which is kind of different for the time. Because if you think about a lot of the movies, it's way more dramatic and introspective, I guess, or I don't want to say deep, but attempting depth, or trying for validation, which is funny because teenagers trying for validation, teenage movies were trying for validation the same way that teenagers were. But it's definitely a running theme. So it was hard to find a movie that I felt was like a straight up comedy. There's also Better Off Dead, if you want like a really offbeat, quirky comedy, romantic comedy. That one's a little bit less about the romance. I mean, there is a romance element to it. It's more of a dark comedy, but I think it does also qualify. You can also think of like Heathers as a romantic dark comedy, and this movie is sort of like the opposite coin of Heathers. I feel like Heathers is like if this movie had JD in it. So it's like what would have happened to this movie if a psychopath had come to the school and wooed Cindy. I can see Cindy going the way of Veronica. So it's an interesting dichotomy of society that's like showing up in the 80s, and all this like cynicism and this like idea of popularity, and like who and like what popularity is for. And I think that idea of popularity only really comes out in the 80s. And I think a lot of that is maybe the social culture at the time being so success, and like what success means, and like the young Republican thing, and that gets like kind of political. But I think a lot of the 80s is about like Wall Street, right? And so a lot of it is like about being the best, and like how do you define what being the best is, and like how do you succeed. So again, that's Can't Pound Me Love. Thank you for joining me. It seems like I really enjoyed the discussion. It seemed very productive to me. I hope you guys got something out of it. And next week we are watching Never Been Kissed, which is an interesting movie. I'm looking forward to making a video about it because, geez, I watched a little bit of it today. I know that I don't know how many of you guys have seen it. I haven't seen it since '99, probably, or like 2001. So I'm looking forward to like looking back at that. And I will see you guys next Wednesday. So look out for my video on Tuesday or Wednesday morning. And I will see you guys then. Thank you for joining. And I'll have a link again to the syllabus and the Venmo in my show notes in case you want to support the show. And there will be some videos popping up or something. Don't forget to like and subscribe, yada, yada, yada. I will see you guys next week.